He said it out loud, in front of witnesses. That was the first mistake. Not the decision to cross the ridge, not the contempt for an enemy he had never actually fought, not the 7 weeks of mounting arrogance since he had arrived at Fort Phil Kearny in the frozen Wyoming territory in November 1866. The first mistake, the one that history would carve into stone beside his name, was saying it where people could hear it and write it down. Give me 80 men, and I'll ride through the whole Sioux nation. Captain William Judd Fetterman, Civil War veteran, twice breveted for gallantry in Georgia, a man who had led thousands through 4 years of the bloodiest war on American soil and emerged decorated, unbroken, and absolutely certain he understood what war was. The old scout, Jim Bridger, heard the boast. Bridger had spent 30 years in this country. He knew the Crow and the Shoshone and the Lakota the way other men knew their own kitchen floors. Every sound, every corner, every place where the light was wrong. He had carried a Blackfoot arrowhead in his spine for 3 years before anyone dug it out. He looked at Fetterman and said, with the flat, exhausted patience of a man who has watched this particular era before, "Your men who fought down south are crazy. They don't know anything about fighting Indians." Fetterman did not listen, and somewhere out on the frozen ridges above Pinot Creek, a 25-year-old Oglala warrior was already building the answer. "Before I take you to that ridge, I need to set the board. Because the Fetterman fight is not just the story of one man's arrogance. It is the story of two completely different theories of war meeting in a frozen Wyoming valley, and about which one was actually right. Fort Phil Kearny sat on the Bozeman Trail, the road that gold-hungry men had cut through the heart of Lakota hunting territory to reach the Montana goldfields. Red Cloud, the Oglala Sioux chief who had refused to sign any treaty permitting the trail, had been fighting to close it since the moment the Army began building forts along it in the spring of 1866. He was not trying to win pitched battles. He understood something the Army did not, that he did not need to destroy the forts militarily. He only needed to make them unsustainable, keep the soldiers pinned down, exhausted, unable to gather wood or food, bleeding men in ones and twos every week until Washington concluded the whole enterprise was not worth the cost. It was working. By December 1866, Colonel Henry Carrington commanded Fort Phil Kearny with barely 40 rounds of ammunition per soldier. His requests to Washington for reinforcements had disappeared into bureaucratic silence. His best intelligence asset, the veteran mountain man Jim Bridger, who could read Lakota tactical intentions the way a doctor reads symptoms, had been ordered by Washington to have his salary cut and then dismissed altogether. Carrington refused to dismiss him. He had nothing else. What Carrington could see from the fort's signal station on Pilot Hill was that the Lakota attacked his wood trains with a precision and patience that had no equivalent in anything the Civil War had produced. They did not mass and charge. They appeared and vanished. They struck the wagons 2 miles out and withdrew before a relief column could close the distance. They studied the garrison's response patterns the way a chess player studies an opponent, noting how fast the soldiers moved, which routes they favored, how far they would pursue before turning back. One man in particular had been doing the studying for weeks. In the winter of 1866, Crazy Horse was not yet the warrior that history would make him. He was young, largely unknown outside his own people, but he had been watching Fort Phil Kearny with the patient, clinical attention of a military mind that had not been trained in any academy but was no less precise for that. And on December 6th, 1866, 15 days before the ambush, he discovered something that would become the foundation of everything. He discovered that American soldiers could not stop chasing. On December 6th, Crazy Horse rode close to the fort with a small party and allowed himself to be seen. The soldiers came out. He led them, a careful, measured, just fast enough withdrawal, toward a prepared position where more warriors waited in concealment. The trap almost worked completely. 2 soldiers were killed. Lieutenant Bingham was killed. The command narrowly avoided total destruction. Fetterman came back to Carrington afterward and said something that deserves to be read slowly. He said, "This Indian war has become a hand-to-hand fight requiring the utmost caution." He had learned the lesson. He had said the lesson out loud to his commanding officer. And then, 15 days later, he forgot it entirely. Because here is what Civil War training did to an officer's mind. And this is the part that most histories skip over because it requires saying something uncomfortable. Fetterman was not a fool. He was the product of a military doctrine that had been tested in 4 years of the most intense combat the American continent had ever produced. And that doctrine said, when the enemy retreats, you pursue. Pursuit converts a tactical victory into a strategic one. You press until they break. That was not arrogance. That was the distilled lesson of every successful engagement from Gettysburg to Atlanta. Crazy Horse had spent 15 days building a plan around that single, specific, exploitable certainty. Now I want to stop and explain exactly what the decoy tactic was, because this is the part that people who weren't there have never fully understood, And understanding it is understanding everything that happened on December 21st, 1866. The decoy was not simply running away and hoping soldiers followed. That is the campfire version. The real version was something far more precise. A performance, rehearsed in advance, calibrated to a specific audience. Crazy Horse and his 10 warriors were selected from the best riders among the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. 2 from each band, according to the Fort Phil Kearny battle records, a deliberate composition that gave the decoy party unified tribal commitment. Their instructions were specific. Move slowly enough that the soldiers believe they can catch you. Not too fast, not too slow. Stay just at the edge of range. And above all, perform weakness. Show the soldiers what they want to see. What the soldiers wanted to see, what their entire military formation was conditioned to interpret, was a fleeing enemy. A retreating enemy was a breaking enemy. A breaking enemy was a defeated enemy. Every instinct 4 years of civil war had built into these men said, run them down. Crazy Horse understood this. He did not need to be told. He had watched it happen on December 6th, and he had filed it away with the precision of a man who pays very close attention to what works. The accounts that survive, from Lakota warriors interviewed years later by Judge Eli Ricker of Nebraska, from Cheyenne testimony recorded by historians, describe Crazy Horse during the retreat on December 21st, stopping his horse, dismounting, performing an elaborate pantomime of adjusting his bridle as if the horse had thrown a shoe, making himself appear stranded, vulnerable, alone, then remounting and continuing, just fast enough, just close enough. Behind Lodge Trail Ridge, 2,000 warriors lay flat in the frozen ground. Cheyenne and Arapaho on the west side of the trail, Lakota on the east, pressed into the earth, behind rocks, in ravines and draws, in positions that a column approaching along the trail would not see until the exact moment the trap closed. They had been there since before dawn. The morning of December 21st, 1866, was clear and bitterly cold. The kind of cold that makes the inside of your nose freeze on the first breath outside. The kind of cold that turns the metal of a rifle action stiff and makes the fingers needed to operate it unreliable. At 10 in the morning, the signal station on Pilot Hill flagged that the wood train was under attack. The same attack that had happened dozens of times before in the same location. Carrington ordered a relief party under Captain James Powell. Before the men moved out, Fetterman walked up and invoked his seniority. He wanted the command. Carrington gave it to him, then stopped him at the main gate and delivered his orders a second time, face to face, looking directly at the man. Do not pursue the Indians beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. He said it twice. There were witnesses to both instances. This is documented. 81 men rode out of Fort Phil Kearny at approximately 11 in the morning, 49 infantrymen on foot, 27 cavalry under Lieutenant Grummond, 2 civilians, James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher, who had come along to test their new Henry repeating rifles. Captain Frederick Brown, the post quartermaster, who was being transferred out but had told anyone who would listen that he intended to take Red Cloud's scalp before he left. The wood train had already broken free of the attack and moved on. The attack had been a feint to draw the column out. Crazy Horse and his 10 riders appeared on the ridge. What happened next was witnessed from the fort and reconstructed from the physical evidence found afterward, from Lakota and Cheyenne accounts recorded in the years that followed, and from Colonel Carrington's official report filed January 3, 1867. Grummond's cavalry rode ahead of Fetterman's infantry almost immediately. This was the first fracture, the command splitting in exactly the way the terrain was designed to exploit. The cavalry were fast, the infantry were not. A gap opened between them on the frozen road as Grummond chased the decoys toward Pino Creek. Crazy Horse crossed the frozen ford. The cavalry followed. The moment Fetterman's column disappeared over Lodge Trail Ridge and out of sight of the fort, 2,000 warriors rose from the ground on both sides of the trail simultaneously. The infantry were carrying Springfield muzzleloaders, single shot. In ideal conditions, dry hands, calm, unhurried, a trained soldier could manage perhaps 3 rounds per minute. These were not ideal conditions. The temperature was far below zero. Fingers that had been gripping reins on a cold horse for 30 minutes were not performing at textbook speed. The reload sequence, bite the paper cartridge, pour the powder, seat the ball, ram it home, cap the nipple, cock, aim, fire, was a 12-step mechanical process that required fine motor control in hands that the cold had already begun to compromise. The cavalry carried 7-shot Spencer carbines. Better. But there were only 27 cavalrymen, and Grummond had ridden them a mile ahead of the infantry, into a separate section of the ambush that was waiting specifically for them. The 2 civilians, Wheatley and Fisher, with their Henry repeating rifles, 15 rounds each, lever action, reload in under 2 seconds, made the longest stand on that field. The physical evidence confirmed it. The concentration of spent Henry cartridge casings around their final position was the densest on the entire battlefield. 2 men with private civilian weapons performed better than any other unit in the command because they had the one thing the Army had repeatedly decided was too expensive to issue to its soldiers: a rifle that could keep firing without a 12-step reload between every shot. They died anyway. But the Lakota accounts say they accounted for more warrior casualties than any other group on the field. The infantry stand lasted approximately 20 minutes, a space 40 feet square, according to the men who found them. The physical footprint of soldiers who had clustered together at the end, who had run out of ground and ammunition and time simultaneously. Only 6 of the 81 were killed by bullets. The rest died in hand-to-hand combat, in the final collapse of a command that had nothing left to fire. The bugler, Adolf Metzger, was the last. His bugle was found smashed, used as a weapon after his ammunition was gone. The Lakota warriors, in a documented act of battlefield respect for a man who fought alone until the end, did not mutilate his body. They covered it with a buffalo robe. The entire engagement lasted 40 minutes. At the fort, Margaret Carrington heard the firing stop. She would write about it later, not in clinical language, not in the measured prose of official record, but with the precision of a woman who had been listening to that sound for weeks and understood exactly what its stopping meant. She had already written in her journal that fighting these warriors required a fundamental revision of everything the Army thought it knew. Her words, recorded in her 1868 book, Absaraka, Home of the Crows, are the clearest single-sentence description of what Fetterman walked into. These Indians are everywhere where you suppose they are not, and are certain to be nowhere where you suppose them to be. In ambush and decoy, splendid. In horsemanship, perfect. In strategy, cunning. Captain Tenike reached Lodge Trail Ridge at 12:45 in the afternoon. He looked down into the Pinot Creek Valley from the top of the ridge and saw a very large force of warriors below. Some rode toward his position and called up to him. Tenike had approximately 54 soldiers. He sent a message back to Carrington requesting artillery support. He waited. The warriors dispersed. He advanced carefully and found what Crazy Horse's plan had made of Fetterman's 81 men. That night, Colonel Carrington sent a scout named John Portugee Phillips on one of the most extraordinary rides in American frontier history, 236 miles to Fort Laramie. 4 days through blizzard conditions, sleeping on his horse, in temperatures that killed exposed men in hours. On Christmas night, 1866, Phillips burst through the doors of a full-dress garrison Christmas ball at Fort Laramie. Uniformed officers and their wives in Victorian finery, a string quartet, champagne, and handed Carrington's dispatch to the commanding general. The dispatch read, "I send you the most heart-rending news that it has been my misfortune to record. 3 officers, 76 enlisted men. 2 civilians, 81 total, 0 survivors." The nation read those numbers the following week. It was, at that moment, the worst military defeat the United States Army had ever suffered on the Great Plains. Now I want to tell you something about this battle that almost nobody mentions, something that sits in the archive and waits for someone to read it carefully. Red Cloud was not present at the Fetterman fight. He was elsewhere that day. The tactical architect of the ambush was a Minneconjou Sioux chief named High Backbone, who had worked with Crazy Horse to plan and position the 2,000-man concealment with a coordination and discipline that Army officers reviewing the battle afterward described in their reports as unlike anything they had encountered from any enemy force. Not Confederate, not Mexican, not anything. A planned ambush requiring 2,000 warriors to lie motionless in frozen ground in sub-zero temperatures for hours, maintain absolute silence, and execute a simultaneous 2-sided envelopment on a signal. This was not improvised. This was planned, rehearsed, and executed with a precision that would have been notable in any army on earth in 1866. The name the Lakota gave this battle tells you everything about how they understood it. Not a massacre, not an ambush. The Battle of the 100 Slain, from a prophecy made by a warrior named Finger before the engagement, who had promised Red Cloud that 100 soldiers would die. He had ridden out on 3 previous occasions, trying to fulfill the promise and come back with fewer. On his 4th attempt, December 21st, 1866, he rode back to camp staggering under the weight of 100 coup sticks, 1 for each soldier dead. The promise had been made before the battle, the number had been chosen as a target, and the tactical machinery constructed to hit that target, 10 decoys, 2,000 concealed warriors, a frozen valley, a man's boast used against him like a weapon, had delivered 81. Close enough. The promise was kept. The United States Army's response to the Fetterman fight took 2 years to fully materialize. Reinforcements came, new rifles, the breech-loading Springfield, which would prove its worth at the wagon box fight 8 months later, were issued. Tactics were revised. And then, in 1868, the government did something it had never done before and would never do again in the history of the Indian Wars. It signed the Fort Laramie Treaty on Red Cloud's terms, abandoned all 3 forts on the Bozeman Trail, walked away. Red Cloud watched the soldiers leave. Then his warriors burned every fort to the ground. It was the only war in the history of the American frontier in which the United States government was defeated, acknowledged the defeat, and gave the victor what he had demanded. Every fort gone, every soldier out, every claim abandoned. It had started on December 6th, 1866, when Crazy Horse rode close to the fort and discovered that American soldiers could not stop chasing. And it had ended on December 21st, when he gave them something worth chasing. 10 riders, a frozen ridge, and 2,000 men waiting on the other side of it. Fetterman had said, give him 80 men, and he would ride through the whole Sioux nation. What he found, in the 40 minutes it took the valley to go quiet, was that 80 men was exactly what Red Cloud had been waiting for, and that the man who built the trap had never once needed more than 10 to spring it.